All right. Just a couple announcements is that the review session will be in lane 125. Okay, so that's Monday evening at 9 o'clock. Also, my office hours tomorrow, I have to go to a doctor's appointment, so I'm not going to be there in the afternoon. But I'll probably be there like 3 to 5. I think I'll be able to get back by then. So I'll try and stop by the office tomorrow afternoon, in the late afternoon. And then Thursday I'll be in much of the day, 9 to 12, and then early afternoon. And then Friday I have to leave at 2, so I'll only be in 1 to 2 on Friday. Yeah. What's the review session? What time? The review session is at 9 o'clock on Monday. Okay, lane 125. Fan pick of the week this week is a rhythm and blues duo out of Chicago. It's called Drama. Now there's another band called Drama. It turns out if you take my law and economics class, you can't copyright a name. So you might check this out. If you put if you do the Drama Chicago, you'll hit them. They do, it's a female lead vocalist. They are going to be at South by Southwest. I don't know if have anybody ever been to South by Southwest? It's a summer music festival that's in Texas. So anyway, you might take a look at that band, Drama. All right. I'm going to take roll today, just because I feel like it. Okay, Mason. Here. Catherine Bissett. Yeah. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay. Okay, Lauren. Taylor. Hannah Breeding. Nathan. Amber Butters. Ambrose. Nicholas. Anyway, Ambrose was waiting for me to say something, but I'm not. Jacob. Reagan. Andrew Gandy. Matthew Brunswick. Lauren Hearn. Elizabeth Hughes, Emma Johnson, Joseph Johnson. There you are. Because it's not Joseph, it's Josiah. Not Joseph. Okay, Josiah. Luke Keller. John Lanning. John McCarthy. Morgan Morrison. John Ortman, Tyler, Christine Tanner, Sophia, Noah, Andrew. I like the 10 o'clock class, and a whole bunch of people weren't here today. I wonder what was up with them, but okay, Frank. Here. And Stephen Whitney. All right. So last time we were talking about sort of leading into this idea of the Bill of Rights. Darn, I forgot and at 10 o'clock I forgot to talk about Marbury versus Madison. That's okay. I'll remind myself. We said that there's this issue of the Bill of Rights, and there was a discussion about that. And in particular, Hamilton was arguing that it didn't make sense to have it. Okay? But Hamilton said two problems. One is, are these our only rights? Remember that we said that, Hayek was talking about the in sort of the history of how individual liberty came about was it started with the granting of certain rights, and then eventually we got to the point where we believe that we have inalienable rights and that the government's there to protect us from, intrusion on these inalienable rights that we have. So Hamilton is saying, well, if we write down we have the right to bear arms and we have the right to peaceful assembly, that must mean that we didn't have those rights before. And how do I know what rights that we have? So if I start writing down these rights, isn't going to imply that these are our only rights. And the second problem was, does the federal government have implied powers? Right? Are there powers there that we didn't write down? Because what you're telling me is the federal government shall enact no law regarding the establishment of religion nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But I look over in Article 1, Section 8, and it doesn't say that it has the power to do that. So why in the world do I need something that says government doesn't have the power to do something which I didn't tell them that they had the power to do? So am I implying then that the government has these powers that we didn't say that they have? Does the federal government have powers that are non-enumerated? So what happened was, historically then, there was a sort of a compromise, and what happened was the Constitution was ratified without the Bill of Rights. And then what happened is Madison offered 12 amendments in the first Congress. And 10 of these became the Bill of Rights. Actually, one of the other two passed in 1992, so it took them a couple hundred years to get the second, that one done. That was the amendments to the Constitution that made it so that Congress couldn't pass an increase in its own salary. It could increase the salary of the next Congress coming in, but it couldn't increase its own salary. So that hasn't passed in 1992. And the other one never was ratified. But anyway, the first 10 become the Bill of Rights. And the solution to this problem was, this is the 9th Amendment, and this is the 10th Amendment. If we look at it, the 9th Amendment says that let's see here, hold on. It says, the enumeration of rights in the Constitution shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Right? So what does it say? It says the fact that you wrote down these rights doesn't mean that there aren't other rights that are out there. The 10th Amendment, satisfies this question. It says the power is not specifically delegated by the Constitution to the United States government, nor prohibited by it to the states, are retained by the states to the people respectively. So it says all those powers not specifically granted by the Constitution to the federal government, those powers, all the rest of the powers are retained by the states and the people. So that if I want to look at whether the federal government has the power to do something, let's say to pass a law that deals with higher education, I should be able to look in Article 1, Section 8 and see if Congress has the power to do that, right? So the 10th Amendment is to state that there are no implied powers, right? Only enumerated powers. There's no arbitrary power that we were, it was the founders were concerned about, right? The founders said, we're concerned because in 1767 the British Parliament passed that resolution basically saying it had arbitrary power. We don't think that's the way it ought to go. So the 9th and 10th Amendments then become a compromise in the sense that we say, okay, we're going to pass those Bill of Rights, but we're going to say those aren't the only rights that we have, and your federal government only has the powers that are given to it by the Constitution. Now, it's sort of interesting that when the Affordable Care Act was passed, during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, there's a question about whether the federal government had the power to require you to buy health insurance. And the Speaker of the House at the time, who's remained nameless, but is currently Speaker of the House, she said that state governments have the power to require you to buy car insurance. Surely that means that the federal government has the power to require you to buy health insurance. Well, that shows not a clear knowledge of what the 10th Amendment says, right? The fact that your state government has, even if your state government required you to buy health insurance, the fact that the state government has that power doesn't say that the federal government has that power. In fact, all sorts of powers are retained by the states. Sometimes you hear about discussion about states' rights. Well, there aren't states' rights, there are states' powers, okay? There's nothing in the Constitution that talks about the rights of states. There's a kind of provision about talking about the powers of states. And so unless the Constitution says the state government can't do this, then it can do it, right? Now, the state may decide in its own constitution not to do it, but those powers not specifically prohibited by the states. So, for example, the Constitution says that the state can't require you to have a visa to cross from Illinois to Ohio, right? And they can't charge an excise tax or they can't set up a tariff that says that if you bring in something from Ohio into the state of Illinois, then you got to pay a tax on it. Okay, they can charge a sales tax in Illinois, and then if you bring in something that you bought from Ohio, it could charge you the sales tax that you would have paid if you'd been in Illinois. But it can't charge you something extra from the state of Ohio just because you're bringing it into Illinois. So that leads us, well, first of all, anybody know how in a 5-4 decision the Affordable Care Act was satisfied? It's because if I don't know if you've received one of these, but you get a form from your employer or wherever you have your health insurance from that you can file with your income tax if you have to, saying that you had insurance over the course of the year, because the penalty for not having insurance is not a fine, it is a tax, right? So in a 5-4 decision, it was declared that under the power to tax, the federal government has the power to require you to buy health insurance, as long as the penalty is to pay a tax. Now, during the debate on the bill, it was oftentimes declared that this is not a tax, okay? But then in the end, they needed to be a tax for it to be declared constitutional, so it was. I wrote a little piece on this that under this logic, I could require everybody that had an IQ under 100 to be sterilized as long as the penalty was a tax, right? So what is the limit on what the federal government can do if it only penalizes you by having a tax? But obviously the Supreme Court didn't take account of my article. All right. So then there's a debate about the 9th Amendment, actually, that between folks that believe in limited government, some folks that believe in limited government think the 9th Amendment is a good thing, and some think that it's a problem. So what does Hayek say? In the Constitutional Liberty, in Chapter 12, Hayek says that we ought to use the 9th Amendment more, in fact. Right? He argues that some decisions that were actually made under the 14th Amendment should have been made under the 9th Amendment. Because what he argues is that this limits the coercive power of the legislative and executive branch. So that's his concern. He thinks that the executive branch and the legislative branch are going to be coercive and will use the Ninth Amendment in order to limit what the executive and legislative branch can do. So again, in Chapter 12, he has a discussion about the Ninth Amendment, arguing that it's an important amendment, and again, that it ought to be used more frequently rather than the 14th Amendment. On the other hand, you have two judges, Bork and Scalia. Scalia was the Supreme Court justice for a while, passed away not too long ago. But they argue that, in fact, the Ninth Amendment is a threat to liberty. It allows the judiciary to be coercive. To be coercive. And we ought to worry about the Ninth Amendment. That is, they argue that what's going to happen is the judiciary could discover all sorts of rights. For example, the judiciary might find out, oh, there's a right to health care, right? It's not listed, it's not an enumerated right, but we have this right to health care that's not listed. Therefore, the federal government needs to provide Medicare for all, okay? I just saw a CNBC poll that showed that I think 65% of Americans think that we ought to have Medicare for everybody. Okay? So maybe that's a right that's discovered by the judicial branch. And so what that would do is that would allow the judiciary to basically legislate from the bench, right? And remember that Hayek and Madison and Montesquieu were all concerned about the separation of powers, okay? And so what Bork and Scalia, Bork's got a book called Tempting of America, which is a book worth reading, where one of the things that he talks about is the problem with the Ninth Amendment. So, for example, there was, I don't know, there was a court case, I don't know if you heard of it, it's called Roe versus Wade. And what it came down to was there was a Connecticut court opinion where a woman was trying to get contraceptives. There's a law in Connecticut against being able to purchase contraceptives. And she argued that under the right to privacy, she had the right to buy contraceptives. And so the court ruled that was a right. And then this right to privacy was then used in this court decision, Roe versus Wade. Okay? So notice that when Hayek is writing is 1960. Okay? So in 1960, it is probably true that the problem lies with the coercive power of the the executive and legislative branch. In 1969, we get Earl Warren becomes Supreme Court Justice, and the Warren Court becomes an activist court, right? So if you look at Earl Warren, and that court becomes where it is sometimes you hear about this living constitution that says that the court should interpret, here's what the founders would have said if they'd have known what was going on today. Sort of the other side is the side of the strict constructionists, would say, no, strict construction of the Constitution says, no, you just got to read exactly, here's what it says, okay? And you can't just start putting stuff in there. So the Bork and Scalia are concerned about this activist judiciary legislated from the bench. Notice that on this side of the view of the situation would be Madison. Madison talks about how the judiciary is the branch of government least to be feared. And then we also had Bastiat, right? Bastiat says, has anyone ever heard of someone becoming before the Court of Appeals to engage in legalized plunder, right? Like this can't happen. So if your view on the Ninth Amendment, there's a debate, actually the Cato Institute has a couple of books on this debate about the Ninth Amendment between limited government folks, some limited government folks on the side of Hayek, Madison, Bastiat, that would say the Ninth Amendment's an effective barrier against coercion by the executive and legislative branch. And then the other side are the Bork and Scalia view that the Ninth Amendment gives too much power to the judiciary, and judiciary is not elected, and so you could end up with all sorts of activist legislation that is coercive. Again, they might find a right to parental leave, and all people that hire, all employers would have to provide parental leave to their employees. We find that in the Ninth Amendment, and so you could have. And actually, it turns out that in this poll, 85% of Americans believe that the government should require employers to provide parental leave. So what would show up if we have a broad view of the Ninth Amendment? It's also interesting that, first of all, as I mentioned that I forgot to tell the 10 o'clock class, that there is no provision in the Constitution for judicial review, right? Right? You can't open up the Constitution and find that the Supreme Court has the power to declare laws constitutional or unconstitutional. That doesn't occur until Marbury versus Madison, where John Marshall, who's Chief Justice, finds that in fact it does, and this is 1803. So it isn't until 1803 that we have the federal government reviewing what the legislature can do. Now, of course, the legislature wasn't passing nearly as many things in the 1790s as it was today. And so the question probably didn't come up very often. And in fact, I think, I don't know if Hayek talks about this, but there was a very few cases of something being unconstitutional happen for the first 40 years or so of the founding. It's also interesting to note that in chapter 12, Hayek talks about the 1937 court. Okay. So what Hayek says is the 1937 court, this was the, where it was the National Recovery Act, was unconstitutional. And he argues this is a case of the court limiting the course of power, right, of the executive branch, and the executive and legislative branch. So recall that what was going on in the 1930s was we had the Great Depression started really in the end of 1928, and the Roosevelt administration is passing all sorts of pieces of legislation under the Great Society, or not the Great Society, the New Deal, right? It was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but so anyway, so I passed it under the New Deal. And as part of that, the Supreme Court rules that this National Recovery Act goes beyond what the federal government has the power to do. And Hayek argues, again, that, remember that he says that democracies are particularly liable when trying to reach ad hoc decisions to result in essentially unintended consequences. that result in something that people wouldn't have wanted to have in the end anyway. You know, I use the example of the franchise bills and, you know, with the auto dealers and farm implement dealers, et cetera. And so what Hayek argues is that it's better to not solve a particular problem and stay within the bounds of the Constitution than to have a particular problem and you got to go outside the bounds of the Constitution in order to solve it. He argues that, you know, what you need to do is, if that's really the case, then you need to amend the Constitution to allow you to do what you are prohibited from doing. Now, it's interesting that in the same, that in the Tempting of America, Bork, he argues that this was a case of the Supreme Court, the same court case. He says, this is a case of the Supreme Court not liking the public policy. That is, he argues that what happened was the Supreme Court was basically legislating from the bench. That this was something that would have been constitutional, but this was an activist Supreme Court. So again, it's interesting to have Bork, Robert Bork, who is basically more of a limited government type guy, in the Tempting of America, bringing up the exact same case that Hayek is bringing up in Constitutional Liberty on opposite sides of what the Supreme Court is doing. Again, Bork and Scalia concerned with this activist judiciary, and Hayek and Madison and Bastiat, they're all concerned with this activist executive and legislative branch. And of course, we know, of course, what happened here is that the court sort of switched. It's requiring things, or saying things that are unconstitutional. Why did that happen? It's the famous packing of the court, right? That is, what did Roosevelt say? He says, you know what? Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says there's only 9 members of the Supreme Court. How about we make it so there's 150 members and I get to appoint all the rest, right? So that they didn't end up doing that, but the Supreme Court started saying these New Deal programs were constitutional after the threat of the packing of the court. But yeah, do you have a thought on that?
Oh, no.
Okay. So yeah, so in the event, it's interesting to look at the both sides of the issue. 2 things. One is there's an article called The Forgotten Ninth and 10th Amendment by Roger Pilon of the Cato Institute that he wrote in 1991. And I believe that's in your folder. It's called Forgotten Ninth and 10th Amendments. And it goes, it's a lengthier piece than Hayek talking about this history of the 9th and 10th Amendments and the Hamilton's concerns about what would happen if you put the Bill of Rights in and how all that goes about. So you might want to take a look at that. Another guy that writes on this stuff is named Randy Barnett. He writes a lot of this on this stuff if you're interested in delving into a little more detail. I also put on this in the folder an article called "Will Democrats Regret Weaponizing the Judiciary?" So it deals with this whole same idea. It's a recent it's a recent article. But anyway, it's called it's on the server, or not the server, but it's in the Wolfram, the Econ 105 folder called "Will Democrats Regret Weaponizing the Judiciary?" So you might want to take a look at that. All right. So if we were last point is thinking about how effective how effective the Constitution has been in limiting the course of power of your government. That's sort of up to you. You'll notice that I will ask on, sometimes on the midterms, ask you to give your thoughts on that. Because what's gone on here, right, is Bastiat and Mises talking about how government ought to be limited, right? And Hayek saying same thing, government ought to be limited, protection of life, liberty, and property. And he offers an institutional structure, right? He talks about if the laws have these certain characteristics, right? If they are general and apply equally to everyone, and they're avoidable, they're known and predictable, they're more likely to limit coercion. But what's the institutional structure that you put in place as the Constitution? So the question might be, does that work very well, right? Certainly your federal government has a lot more powers and is doing more things than it did in 1960 when Hayek was writing the book, right? When Hayek was writing the book, they weren't telling you that you have to buy health insurance and that your cars have to get so many miles per gallon and all sorts of things, right? You can't drink, things that you can't eat things that have trans fats in them and all sorts of stuff, okay? So that's in your own. So that's sort of going to be your own opinion. But maybe things would have gotten more coercive. Maybe we would have had more coercion than we otherwise would have. But that's just your opinion to think about it. But John C. Calhoun, he wrote that all governments will overstep their constitutional boundary. And so what's his solution to that? His solution is that you ought to be able to secede, right? That is, if the state of Ohio could secede from the Union, it would put a limit on what your federal government could do. Calhoun's saying, hey, guess what? You can write a constitution down, but everybody's going to have an incentive to overstep those boundaries. So what is a powerful limitation on this coercive power of your federal government? It's if the state governments could just get out of Dodge, just say, okay, hey, we're no longer in it. So can you secede or not, right? We had a debate about that from 1861 to 1865. It was settled that you can't secede in the United States. But there are countries where you can secede. There are countries that have a federalist system where the regional governments or the state governments or provincial governments can secede. Anybody know of one close by? Canada, right? If you're in Canada, you can secede. If you're in Quebec in particular, right? So every now and then there'll be a vote whether Quebec is going to secede from Canada. They always vote no. But the provision's there, right? So if you think about it, there might be certain circumstances where you don't want to have secession. That might lead you to a problem such as we have with the Articles of Confederation, right? How do I know that we're all going to hold together? How do I know that if somebody gets invaded and we declare war and some state just says, okay, forget it, we're not getting involved in that war, we're seceding, okay? But it might be that you might be more willing to form a country if you had, we talked about last time about how Madison was talking about having a federalist system. So you might be more willing, if you're the Kurds, to join Iraq as a nation if you could have your own state of Kurdistan, and in particular if that state could secede if the federal government became coercive. So if you take Professor Clark's class in Constitutional Political Economy, you can discuss this issue about there might be circumstances where you might want to have a provision for secession in your Constitution. There might be cases where you don't want to have it. Excuse me. Again, if your concern is more about this Articles of Confederation problem, then you may not want to have an ability to secede. If you think that people are going to be more concerned about a authoritarian government coming in and doing bad things to you, you might want to have that extra ability to see it as an extra provision that limits what your government can do. You might have heard of a guy named Murray Rothbard. He was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, passed away a few years ago. But he wrote a book called For a New Liberty. And he wrote that in the 1970s. And in it, he argues that you ought to have no government. That all governments become coercive, and we'd be better off with no government at all. It's an interesting book. He has some interesting views of what might happen if you didn't have a government. That is, you'd end up, he argues how you might end up with private courts, and that insurance companies might hire private firms to be the police to keep stuff from being stolen because the insurance companies don't want stuff to get stolen, and just this whole, and I don't find it particularly persuading, but I do think it's sort of interesting to sort of think through, okay, what might happen if you didn't have any government at all. So anyway, you can go from the extreme of totalitarian governments to the other extreme, the Rothbardian extreme of no government at all. All right, so if we sort of summarize what Hayek was talking about, right? Hayek's idea is that what? Information is decentralized. That's where he starts out. The best use of that is what? Everybody acts according to their own plan. So what's government to do, right? Government's purpose is to minimize coercion. That is, coercion being acting according to someone else's plan. And what does that lead to? Government's got to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Notice, again, on the old exams, particularly on the final exam, I'll certainly ask you to give me the logic by which, each of the three authors that we've talked about, Bastiat, Mises, and Hayek, how they get to what they believe the role of government is and how do they get there, okay? And in particular here, we talked about Mises saying that he wants to create wealth for the masses. The only way to do that is market capitalism, and market capitalism requires a government to limit the protection of life, liberty, and property. Bastiat says we have a natural right to self-defense. Government's a collective organization of that natural right, and a just government fulfills its purpose, which is to protect life, liberty, and property, and so a just government would be limited to that. So again, Hayek starts out with the fact that information is decentralized and goes through and comes up with government being limited by to the protection of life, liberty, and property, and the Constitution is the institutional mechanism by which you try to make that happen. All right. That leads us to the next section, which is looking at Hayek's idea of social evolution, right? That he says that what happens is societies that are successful and have successful characteristics to them will outcompete societies that are not. We don't have pharaohs any longer. We don't build pyramids. We don't build castles. We don't sacrifice virgins to the gods. Those things all are now gone. No one stepped in one day and said, oh, we're not going to have pharaohs anymore. Done. What happened was you have this gradual evolution. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how did the West grow rich? How did it get to where it is? But before, and of course we've looked at theoretically why it should be that way, right? We went through that demonstrated that Mises showing that centrally planned states can't solve the problem of incentives, right? How do you get people to take on the risk of innovation? And how does it solve this problem that information is decentralized? What's the information problem? So we worked in, same with Hayek, we sort of worked theoretically that said, okay, the West ought to get rich if what it does is it turns into a market capitalist system. So there's a theory out there. Then we looked at cross-sectionally. We noted, for example, that I put on the server the two indices of economic freedom, one by the Cato Institute and one by the Fraser Institute, one by Cato and Fraser together, but the Heritage Foundation one and the Fraser Institute one. And we looked through and we said that you take countries that are in the top 25% of the index of economic freedom and compare it to countries that are in the bottom 25%, we find that you're 11 times wealthier if you're in the bottom 10% of the income distribution, if you're in those countries that are in the top 10% or 25% of economic freedom. So cross-sectionally we look at it, and of course it's just obvious. That is, if you're going to be the poorest person, you don't want to be the poorest person in Venezuela today, right? I don't know if you've been following, but they just had another blackout yesterday. They had a nationwide blackout for about 24 hours, which is inconvenient if you're having a heart operation. And you're probably not having heart operations in Venezuela anyway. But you don't want to be poor in Venezuela, right? You'd rather be poor in Canada or the United States or these countries that are in the top 25%. So cross-sectionally, we look at that. So now what we're going to do is look at historically. What led to progress? How did we get here? Clearly, we're wealthier than we were. So that leads us. I'm going to start out with, before we do how the West got rich, I'm going to just start out with an overview of progress. To sort of get to the point of how much progress we've actually made. And we're going to call progress, I'm going to call that an increase in the standard of living. Now, you might have other definitions of progress, just as Bastiat had a definition of justice. You might have other definitions of justice. But we're going to define progress as an increase in the standard of living. So what do you need for this to happen? And I argue two things. One is, what we've talked about several times, is property rights. Right? Mises says that property rights are the key to the civilization. We know that that's one of the foundations of classical liberalism. Hayek makes it clear that property rights are a key to taking on the risk of innovation. So property rights are out there, and in order to, because innovation is what causes an increase in the standard of living. We've brought this up more than once, that you're not wealthier than the King of England in 1263 because you have more tapestries, but you have stuff that the King of England just didn't have, or even could have imagined having. So let's think about this for a minute. Let's say you are the cave woman and you're thinking about making the stone axe. Well, if you're going to make the stone axe, what's going to happen? You got to take the time to think about how it's going to be made. You got to make a prototype of it. You got to make sure that it works. Okay, and then what happens is you spend a week figuring out how to invent the stone axe and actually make one, and then the Geico caveman comes along and just steals it from you. Okay. Well, now you got a problem because you had an opportunity cost to your time. You weren't out there getting roots and berries and other stuff to eat. So now at the end of the week, you got no roots and berries and you got no stone axe. So why would you try to do this, right? So if you're going to innovate, you got to have property rights to it. Otherwise, you're not going to take on that risk of innovation. The second thing is you have to have belief in the individual. And the first one is, you have to, I sort of make this, you have to think that the individual is the unit of account. And we've talked about this before, that is, does the beehive exist for the bees, or do the bees exist for the beehive? We brought up the issue of the movie Ants, where the Woody Allen character argues that the anthill exists to make the ants better off, whereas the folks that are running the anthill are arguing that Woody Allen exists to make the anthill better. That really is a key as to how you think about the world. If you think that you are there to satisfy the unit of account is the tribe, or the unit of account is the government, then you're going to get things happening differently than if you think the government or the tribe exists to make you better off. So, why would you ever have sacrificing virgins, right? The only way you could have sacrificing virgins is to say, okay, it is the society as a whole that's important, and the virgins are just there in order to make society better off for the rest of us. So you're going to have a different way of looking at the world, and you'll have different ways of doing things if you only have, if you believe that it is the society that is the unit of account, and you guys just make up are members of society, and your goal is to make society better, whereas we think that we formed the government in the first place in order to, what, minimize the total amount of coercion, right? So, I mean, this is a different view that Bastiat would have. So let's just, you know, the other thing is that the individual can make a difference. That is, you think that you're capable of improving the situation. If you don't think that you can make a difference, then you're not even going to think in your head about innovation. We're going to talk about this more later on when we talk about the feudal period and how people's view of the world in the feudal period is. But you don't even begin to think about why you might innovate. So let's just think about this. We invent the wheel, and it takes 6,000 years from the time that we invent the wheel till we get a two-wheeled cart. Okay? So, a little bit slow. Right? So then we get this two-wheeled cart, and now we're looking at the movie The Ten Commandments. And in the movie Ten Commandments, what's going on is the Pharaoh is chasing Moses, and then they got two-wheeled carts, right? They're in chariots, and they're chasing them, and Moses parts the Red Sea, and the chariots get flooded, and etc. But nonetheless, important point is here, they got two-wheeled carts. Okay? Now, I just visited my dad and sister in Tucson, and I took my dad out to Tombstone. And anybody know what Tombstone's famous for?
The OK Corral.
Yeah, gunfight at the OK Corral, right? Wyatt Earp's there, and Clantons, and they have a gunfight, and it's October 28th, 1881. And so anyway, Wyatt Earp is an adult at the gunfight at the OK Corral where they got four-wheel carts. Like if you go to Tombstone, you can pay to ride the stagecoach around and they give you a tour, right? So they had stagecoaches and buckboards. When Wyatt Earp dies in 1929, the Model T's there, the Model A's there, Tom Mix is a movie star, he's there. So Wyatt Earp in his adult time went from four-wheel carts to movies and automobiles, right? Something happened. Just think about this. My grandmother was born before the age of powered flight, right? When my grandmother was born, we didn't know how to fly an airplane, right? Now what do we have? Now we have SpaceX. You can buy, you can go out and there's private companies that'll take you off into space, right? Take you up to the space station. So something happened, right? So the question is, why do we get all of a sudden this ramp up in innovation? Why does it take 6,000 years to get a two-wheel cart, and then it takes hundreds of years or thousands of years to get a four-wheel cart, and then all of a sudden you got, Maseratis? All right. So for Friday, what we're going to do is there's a chapter in your book, the Capitalist Manifesto called Progress. We will finish that, and then we will start How the West Grew Rich. So again, Monday, review session, 9 o'clock, lane 125, and then Wednesday's the exam. Right,
Yes, I'm good. I'm so psyched to go to Spanish too because we have more than fans.
They get a full night. Half the time my residents over there, everybody know.